I've been modeling the bombing of Iran for 20 years. The fact is the modeling has held up. And literally month by month by month, when we were first here, the big surprise for most people was that we bombed the regime in Iran and it still stood. It survived, even though we killed the supreme leader and something like 137 of their top leaders. Think about that. So that would be like if somebody killed our president, his wife, the first lady, members of the first family, half of the cabinet, all of the leaders in the Pentagon, all of the leaders in the CIA, and about a third of the Congress. That is what we did to Iran in those opening weeks in March. And nonetheless, that regime survived. And that was something that modeling showed for that 20 years. That was based on substantial patterns in history where air power alone had never toppled a regime, going all the way back to World War I. Most people had not really heard that before. Many people, even in the military, did not fully know how much President Trump went up against the weight of history. Then we shifted. We shifted to 6 weeks of a bombing campaign. And then what did we do? We shifted over to a 2-month blockade. Well, that was another version of punishment. So
the US said that they were going to block the Strait of Hormuz, basically trying to take control of it themselves.
That's right.
And therefore kind of punishing the rest of the world.
Well, they didn't want to punish the world. That did happen, but what they wanted to do was punish Iran. So they were trying to coerce Iran to get the government to surrender control of Hormuz. So keep in mind, what happened is on February 28th, that regime change bombing happened, and it went on for a few days. But by March 2nd, March 3rd, Iran controlled Hormuz, literally within a few days. The ships stopped cold. And they basically have not reopened except for teeny tiny periods of time in a modest way. And then you're stuck. How do you get Iran to give up control of Hormuz, or do you let Iran continue to control Hormuz for as far as the eye can see? That's been the dilemma we've been in, Stephen, since really the first week in March, and now it's become clearer to the world. That is the core dilemma. We're at a fork in the road. Either we physically take Hormuz back, all those other tactics, even the MOU didn't work, didn't get.
The MOU.
The Memorandum of Understanding.
Which was I sat here with JD Vance and he told me that they were about to sign an agreement with Iran to ultimately end the war. And they had that agreement.
Yeah.
JD told me that it was about to be signed. A couple of weeks later, here we are. They're back to bombing each other.
Yeah, there's really two big issues with this, Stephen, with the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. I do believe that Vice President Vance sincerely thought it was going to, had a good chance of ending the war. But there's a big problem here, Stephen, which is when you listen to Vice President Vance, he approached this as a business deal. So he kept talking about all the benefits that were going to come to Iran if they performed, fee for service. We want the strait open, and we're going to offer you money in different ways if you will open the strait. Well, this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of international politics. This may work great in real estate. I'm not saying it doesn't. But in a major war like this, what's at stake is the balance of power. The balance of power. Now, I want to explain that before the war started, there was a balance of power where America was ascendant, Israel was the rising power, and Iran was actually the declining power in the region. What happened almost within, again, 2 weeks of the war starting is the balance of power was shifting dramatically. When Iran became in control of Hormuz, this represents tremendous power in the future. That wealth, all of the potential, that even though it hadn't been realized yet, equates to not just money to put in coffers, but it equates to military power. It equates to the ability to influence other states in the region, to build a sphere of influence. This is power in terms of major power politics that was shifting here. And so with the MOU, as you look at the MOU, JD Vance appears, we could just look at it, he appears to have thought this was a business deal. So he appears to have thought, we're going to hold up the promise of, say, $300 billion. It will eventually fall on you if you will just agree to do what we want and behave. Those aren't the clauses that matter to Iran. The clauses that mattered to Iran were the clauses which directly relate to the balance of power in solidifying Iran, its control of Hormuz. And essentially, this MOU is fundamentally a roadmap to Iran becoming the regional hegemon.
Hegemon? What does that mean?
The most dominant state in the Persian Gulf, in the Middle East.
Wait, so you're saying that this agreement would make them the most dominant state in the Middle East?
Absolutely.
So why wouldn't they sign it within a heartbeat?
They did. They did. Iran, in fact, most of these points were exactly the points that President Trump said he would never sign in April when Iran presented the initial 14-point plan in April.
So
why
are we back at war then?
Well, let me just explain. The key things that happened here is that, number one, notice in Article 5, it says that Iran will make the arrangements with Hormuz, that is the ships with Hormuz, and it will not charge for 60 days. It doesn't say it will never charge. It says only 60 days. So think about that this is already written into the agreement that President Trump is signing. And then if you say, well, what's going to happen down the road? It's going to be Iran and Oman who are going to determine the future fees. There's no mention here of the United States. There's no clause to even let the United States wiggle itself in. This is a perfectly clearly written clause, and this basically gives Iran control of the Strait of Hormuz and also of the discretion to set the fees for as far as the eye can see with no constraint whatsoever.
How do we know that this is the actual document?
Because both the Iranian government and the White House put out exactly the same document, word for word, so that we can actually compare them literally word for word. So this is exactly the document that President Trump signed. There's no question that we have like an earlier draft. Now, there were some earlier drafts leaked by Bloomberg. That's not what this is. This is the final one. But let me go a little bit further here, Steve. So here we're talking about the strategic base of Iran. And keep in mind, controlling Hormuz means controlling 20% of the world's oil. That's a fantastic amount of wealth and strategic power to build on in the future. No limit says nothing about you can't spend it on missiles, anything else. But up here with Lebanon, the first article. So here.
So when you say article, this document contains 10, is it 10?
14.
14 different points. And when you say
14 different points. And there are 3 points that are really the critical action points that matter here. This promise of $300 billion down the road, this is so far, this is like holding out funny money to the Iranians. These are the things that are actually short term because this is happening now.
So point one, you're saying...
Point one I want to come back to, Stephen, because I want to explain. This is Iran's strategic base.
Point number 5.
Point number 5. But what happens to become the dominant power in the region? You need more than a strategic base. You want a sphere of influence. You want a sphere of influence here. And can we?
So I'll hold this up here.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Point number 5 is controlling the Strait of Hormuz. But many of the different countries, including Saudi Arabia, the U.S., have already started to have pipelines to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. There were plans to do this for years. They were too expensive, but almost immediately they started to do that. So the Saudi Arabia started to put out 4 to 5 million barrels of oil a day starting in mid-March into the Red Sea on a pipeline that had already been built and hadn't been used. There's a little area here called Fujairah, which is where the UAE had a pipeline. That's almost 2 million barrels a day. So 20 million barrels a day were going through Hormuz. Almost immediately, 7 million were being bypassed. Then there's all this discussion that Iraq might build some pipelines. There might be other pipelines here going through Syria. So what if you're Iran? You now control this, but notice it's a declining asset that way. If you only control Hormuz within 5 years, good chance your power is going to be whittled away. What you want to do is you want a sphere of influence. So what Iran started to talk about is their security resistance belt, where they wanted to control. And they said from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to the Gulf. This was the leaders of the Revolutionary Guard. And why would you do that? Because you want to prevent all of those bypasses to Hormuz, and they're already happening. And where's the key one? You already have the Houthis down here. You have Hezbollah here, but you want to make sure the Houthis are pretty secure right here.
So just again, for the people that can't see.
Yeah.
So you're saying the Houthis are pretty secure where?
The Houthis are pretty secure down here in Yemen. They've been fighting with the Saudis for quite some time. They've held their own. We fought a war with the Houthis in May 2025 to try to get them to pull back from a temporary shutdown of the Red Sea, and we lost essentially. So we couldn't beat them. But the big one that was at issue was Lebanon, and my point is, it's not so much that they love Hezbollah. They do, of course. They've had long time, decades of relationships with Hezbollah ideologically. There's good reasons for that, but there's something else that's a power reason that's being ignored here, which is you want Hezbollah to have drones right here in Lebanon. So if there's a pipeline that comes out here through Syria, if you've got some other pipelines that are coming out here, you've got Hezbollah here that can act as your Houthis. They can actually attack the shipping. So now you have you're Iran. You're a major power. You're the dominant power in the region. You don't just control this area here and
the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz and Iran itself. You have an arc, a security arc here that is a sphere of influence, but it's an operational sphere of influence. This is not just a piece of paper or something to talk about. This is what's guaranteeing you control all of that oil, whether the oil from the Persian Gulf comes out through Hormuz, whether it comes out through Syria, or whether it comes out through the Red Sea. And that's what Article 1 is about.
So how come...
That's what I'm saying is not, when I listen to Vice President Vance, which I've listened to your interview and other interviews, a super smart guy, okay? This is not a matter of that, okay? But he's thinking of it as a business deal. We want Hormuz open. What's it going to take to pay? They're not looking at that. They're looking at, they want to be a regional hegemon. This is their roadmap, and that's why they stuck to those goals.
But they signed this document, but then the war has kicked off anyway, again.
Because what happened is President Trump signed the document. He owned the document for a day. He explained that he signed the document because this was literally 4 weeks ago, because the world was going to run out of oil in 4 weeks, and he wanted to open Hormuz. So President Trump saw this as a way to try to open Hormuz. But what happened immediately after President Trump signed the document, literally starting in the next 48 hours, is President Trump and his administration started to undermine the document, violate the clauses in that document. So issue number one was Secretary Rubio establishing a framework accord agreement in Lebanon, which essentially would lock in Israel's military presence in Lebanon as far as the eye could see. Whereas Article 1 in the document says that the United States would guarantee the territorial integrity of Lebanon, which everybody would realize would mean Israel is violating the territorial integrity of Lebanon. It's not ensuring it. So that would mean Israel can't be locked in there and still be faithful to Article 1. So the framework agreement immediately violates Article 1. The second thing that happened, and this happened shortly after the framework accord, is President Trump started to encourage passage through the Strait of Hormuz, through the southern, there's 3 routes through the Strait of Hormuz. The central route, which used to be in existence, the main route before the war, now that's where the 80 mines are, so nobody's using the central. They're either passing through the southern avenue, which is the one close to Oman, or they're passing through the Iranian passage, which is, of course, near the coast of Iran. And what President Trump did is he started to encourage this passageway, ships to bypass or pass through Hormuz on the southern passageway, but with no coordination with Iran, with no, even often with their transponders turned off. In fact, President Trump was bragging about this as his secret way to sort of bypass Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. He literally bragged about this on multiple posts on Truth Social. Well, that directly contravenes Article 5. And then the third thing that happened is, if you look at, we haven't looked at Article 11, but if we look at Article 11, you would see that Iran was due to have some of its assets that were seized by the United States and have been held for decades, unfrozen. And there's a specific sentence which gives Iran the exclusive right to determine what's going to happen with that money. And what President Trump said is they can have their money, but only if they give it to the farmers, the U.S. farmers, and buy American grain. That's the third violation of the MOU. So what happened here, Stephen, is President Trump owned the MOU, and was faithful to it for at least a day, maybe two. And this represented a strategic defeat for the United States. And he even explained why he accepted that strategic defeat very clearly and forthrightly. I call that owning the loss. He owned the loss for about a day or two. But then he tried to reverse the loss almost immediately, Stephen. And that's how we're back at war. Because the big miscalculation that happened in this period was assuming that if President Trump didn't restart the war would be over. Who started the war? Who started to shoot the ships in the Strait of Hormuz? It was the Iranians. Why did they do that? Because we were violating the MOU, bypassing their control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that means preventing Iran from becoming the regional power, the rising regional power, ultimately the regional hegemon. So this is why they violated. It wasn't so much a legal understanding. This is great power politics, Stephen. Iran wants to be the dominant state in the region. The United States does not want Iran to be the dominant state in the region. That is what this war has been about since the first week in March, and now it's 5 months later, and we're still at that point. Well, before